So for our next group of images, we start out with Molly's images. In our first photograph of these apples, we have a shallow depth of field, which she has successfully pulled off. The apples in the background are certainly out of focus, and we see this one apple to the right of the frame is definitely in focus. The other thing that she was doing here was side lighting, and again, we can see how that successfully gives us a sense of depth and texture in these apples. The apples, when we see them on a computer screen, it's flat. It's a two-dimensional surface, but perceptually, because of the way she lit it, it seems like this apple is much farther behind this apple on that flat two-dimensional space. So it gives us that illusion of three-dimension. And that's really what lighting from the side is going to bring to the table. It's going to add that sense of three-dimensionality to our images, and it's also going to emphasize texture, which that's the other thing here that I don't think we would ever really notice, sort of all these little spots in the apple and just the way the skin is on it, had she not used that side lighting. With the side lighting and with the area that's out of focus, our eye is really drawn into this area, and that forces us to contemplate or think about it on a grander or deeper scale. And in that sense, we begin to understand more about this apple, at least from a visual perspective. So very successful photo there, Molly. Good job with that. And then the second image is more of a sunset image with the backlit, silhouetted sky in the background. Again, the large depth of field here I think is perfect. And one of the things that, Molly, you do well here is that you give us some compositional elements in here that help the eye work through the frame. So we've got this nice line of the telephone wires here that bring us straight into this beautiful area where the sun is illuminating the clouds from behind. And this is kind of a common lighting scenario that we see in the winter time, but how often do we think to actually go out and capture this? So I applaud you, Molly, for putting on that jacket and braving this cold, awful weather and getting out and shooting. But in doing so, I think you've brought to the viewer here a really aesthetically pleasing image. So good job on both counts there. Well done. And then next on our group of critiques here, we have Devin's photographs. And Devin starts us out with an image of a guitar. And he tells us that what he wants to bring our attention to is the craftsmanship and the workmanship of the guitar, and juxtaposes that against the brick wall in the background. And I think the side lighting that we've got going on here certainly adds to the three-dimensionality of the photograph. The other thing that Devin's doing is giving us a very large depth of field, which by using a wide-angle lens, which he shot this with an 18mm lens, definitely gives us a pretty large depth of field, although it's not as large as it could be. If we went to the file info area here and just took a look at some of his information, we've got an f-stop of 3.5. To really maximize that depth of field, I think I would like to see this f-stop setting be closer to maybe 11, which would force us into an exposure that was probably about 1 second long, which is certainly something that we can pull off. But to do that, the camera's got to be on a tripod or on some sort of steady surface. So speaking of tripods, if you guys have not tried to sign out a tripod in the Media Center, this is just a reminder that in the Media Center you can get tripods, And if you are doing long exposures like this, a tripod really can be a super helpful thing. So Devin, this type of shot, it really screams out for a tripod and a very long exposure that has a correspondingly high aperture value or high f-stop. And remember those words, aperture and f-stop, they're kind of interchangeable. The other thing in your statement, Devin, that you had asked me, and I'll share this with the class, you're struggling to find places and find subjects that work with the crunches of your time frame and your schedule. And it's a tough thing for all of us to get out and shoot, and I think the biggest piece of advice I can offer you is that in those cases you really want to look to things that you are actively involved with. So if baseball practices and working with the team is where you're spending the majority of your day, well, I would advise that you've got to bring your camera along and start shooting parts of that process and use that as something to work with for your assignments. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that you've got to have this grand landscape shot or something exciting and thrilling to share with the audience. Really, in these everyday activities, you can find some great photographs, and they really end up working because you found beauty in the everyday, ordinary things. So finding something that is really aesthetically pleasing in the ordinary is something a good photographer can do. So try maybe shooting some baseball practices or some times that you're spending with the team, and bring the camera along and shoot a practice or a couple practices, and be on the lookout for maybe some of those spontaneous, unrehearsed moments that might provide those of us that don't play baseball maybe a greater insight into what things are like behind the scenes. So those are my 2 cents and advice for everybody. Take pictures of things that you enjoy being around and things that you spend a lot of time with or around. And I'm pretty sure that if you start to really look at those as opportunities for photographs, then I think you will start sharing with the viewer things that you might think are common, but the viewer doesn't necessarily have that same point of view. The viewer's not behind the scenes at a baseball practice or whatever the activity is. So that is my advice, and if you have any other questions or if anybody else can add to that, certainly feel free to join in the conversation in any one of the discussion forums. So Devin, this is all you gave me this week, so look forward to seeing your stuff next week, and just try and push the envelope a little bit and maybe shoot some more stuff along the lines of what you're doing throughout the week. Look forward to seeing your images. So next up we have Ben's work. We've got in his first image a small depth of field and light coming from the side, and what that does is puts the wine bottle in focus and the background out of focus. Again, I think you've done a really good job with the technical aspect of this assignment. Our eye goes right to that bottle of wine and right to the label there. So spot on with that. You probably should get together with Grace from the other set of critiques who shot something similar with a beer bottle. You guys could get together and have a little party in the middle of the winter here and enjoy the indoors. Anyhow, Ben, just joking on that, but the one thing I would caution you about here, you've got this really big, bright spot in the background that is kind of drawing my eye and pulling a little bit of visual weight. If you just kind of move the bottle over maybe about 3-4 inches to this side and not have that bright light behind the bottle of wine, I think it would just be that much stronger of an image. It's a little aesthetic thing, but remember that our eye is going to always go to bright areas of a photograph. And especially in this instance where we have the really dark wine bottle, that eye or that bright area pulls my eye right off of the frame there. So one little thing that I want you to be aware of and think about finessing in your future assignments. Your second image here is the shot of the hockey player, and he's got the stick over his shoulder, and the light coming from the side here. So it looks like your light is kind of coming from this angle here, sort of high and over his right shoulder. Again, when we've got the light coming from the side like this, it creates a really wonderful three-dimensional appearance in our photograph. You know, it feels like the hockey stick here is really close to the viewer, and our guy here is a little bit farther back, and then this background information is even farther behind it. So love the use of lighting in there. In terms of having a large depth of field, again, I think that probably you could do a little bit better with the large depth of field because our poster in the background and the blade of the stick in the foreground are somewhat out of focus. This is probably the type of shot that you would need to go outside and shoot in some brighter light, and that way you'd be able to get that aperture setting a little bit higher. Or on the other end of the scale, perhaps using a wide angle setting on your lens rather than the telephoto setting, which it looks like you used here, which is going to, just by its very nature, have the background and foreground out of focus. The other thing I would say to you with this image kind of reminds me, I'm almost positive I've seen some images of Sidney Crosby sort of in this same position here. So you want to watch out for, even with your portraits, you know, repeating those sort of cliche shots. I think this is one of these standard shots that we see in contemporary hockey portraits. So just again, a caveat to everyone in the class, try and bring some new stuff to the table as you're working with your photography. Last quick thing here, Ben, you are embedding your images in Word documents. If you could just upload them as separate JPEGs to your assignment post, that would be super helpful to me, because then I can work with them in Photoshop, and if I need to make some modifications to them, I can show you how I'm doing that. So just keep that in mind for this week's assignment posts. Thanks. And next up in my group of critiques, I have Anna's images. So Anna has taken the pine tree and put it in the foreground, and the light post and the trees in the background. I think this sort of the soft light that is going on in this image is very representative of winters here in Buffalo, and for me this very much conveys that look and feel of what's going on in Buffalo. The one thing that I think you could just do a little bit better job of here is the background is definitely not entirely out of focus, and I bet if we looked at your settings here, hopefully we've got them embedded, and we do, and it looks like you are using your lens as a wide angle lens, and I think that really is what is giving us, and if you look right there, your focal length is at 4.3 millimeters, which is really wide angle. So when you're at a really wide angle lens, the depth of field is still going to be very wide, no matter what you do with that f-stop. So keep an eye out on that, and you should be able to use a telephoto, so you would want to zoom in your lens to that to 15 millimeter area to get that really wicked depth of field that is going to have everything out of focus in the background. Your second image, you're going to have everything in focus here, and I think you pretty much nailed this one. The museum in the background, we can see the sign there, the trees, everything going on there. The one thing you did mention is that you are having troubles with your exposure, and that's pretty reasonable because even though it seems kind of dull out, you know, the sun isn't out, it's the middle of the winter, what happens is the white in the snow really plays havoc with our light meter. So our light meter readings aren't necessarily always true or always accurate. So it can be a struggle sometimes in getting good exposure. Let's see, let's take a look at your settings here and see what we've got. I do see that you are at an ISO of 80, which I think is great, and your exposure is 1/80th over an f of 5.0. The only thing I might suggest here is actually stopping down just a little bit. So perhaps you want to go to an f-stop of 8 rather than 5.0, and that'll make this just look a little less washed out. Now, of course, in Photoshop we can also do this. We can do a new adjustment layer, new levels adjustment layer, and just take our black slider, which is the one all the way to the left, and just push it to the right a little bit, and you can see how that darkens up our areas that need to be dark, especially within this light post, which is black and needs to be really black versus sort of this washed out gray where it's recording here. So good job on the technical end, just a couple little minor tweaks that we need to make, but otherwise I think you're on a good path here, and we've got some strong images. So look forward to seeing your stuff next week. So last but not least, we have Angela's work, and we've got a birdhouse here that is in focus in the foreground, and the background is out of focus. The thing that I really love about this image is these little drops of, or little icicles, drops of water that froze. And the one thing, again, I think we can do is maybe in Photoshop do a little bit of tweaking here. And so I did a new adjustment layer, a levels adjustment. I push the dark slider towards the center, and then I'm also going to push the middle gray slider towards the middle, and I think that just brings out some more of that detail in that icicle, which I think is really the most interesting part of this image. So this one looks good, technically sound, and I think we've got some interesting composition and subject matter in the photo, so like it. And then we go to our second image here. You had mentioned that you deleted your settings in the camera. Let's see if we've got any data here. Yeah, actually we do have some data. And you can see you're at a focal length of 55 millimeters, which is just ever so slightly towards the telephoto end of things. And you have a setting of 1/125th of a second and an f-stop of 5.7. Your shutter setting was okay. I mean, you're kind of at the border of hand holding things, but that aperture setting of 5.7, that's really going to give us a small depth of field, and that's pretty much exactly what's happening here. You know, we can see your dog's in focus, which looks great, but this object that you've used to frame him or her and the stuff in the background, the towels and the wall, they're all in kind of soft focus here. So that is very much a result of having a small depth of field rather than a large depth of field. What I would recommend, again, to do the large depth of field images is to go outside and try them, because inside your light is very low, so you're going to have to use a low aperture value or a low f-stop setting to let a lot of light into the camera. Therefore, it's going to be very difficult to get a large depth of field inside, especially when you're just using regular household light bulbs. That being said, I think this is kind of an interesting photo. I think it's creative how you've put some stuff in the foreground here to frame your image. Much like your previous image, I probably would play around with our settings just a little bit by adjusting the levels and just bringing out a little bit more detail in your dog, especially because his or her fur is really dark, so it's going to take a little bit of Photoshop magic here to bring some of those details out. And especially this area right here, the eyes I think are very compelling and worth exploring in our images. So good job here with your first image. Your second image, we've got to work on that depth of field, the large depth of field a little bit more. But I do like where you're going with your subject matter, and I think you are doing some creative things with your camera. So keep up the good work on that end, and see if maybe you can pull off a couple images with a large depth of field in the next week or so. So look forward to seeing your images in the upcoming assignment. Thanks.